Hello and welcome to the third episode of the prerequisites discussions that Wolfgang and myself are having around the prerequisites of agility. So this is the things that you should consider before starting a sort of agile transformational change program. Welcome, Wolfgang.
Yeah, welcome, Simon. Hello.
Cool. So today, we're going to be having a discussion about the who. So the previous sessions were about the what is it we're doing, and also about the why are we doing this? And today we'll be talking about who. So it's definitely worth watching those other episodes first, but if you are just watching this one, you should still be able to get some really good, useful information around who to include in this change program.
Right. Yeah, it's always critical to know, who is involved there. And it's not just about who's kicking it off, who is starting the discussion, but really who is involved in the sense of pulling it all the way through and making it a success, right?
And I think this is one of the real critical points actually with the who, because so many change programs, especially in the past, and I think people are starting to couple onto this idea that everybody has to go through this kind of shift both internally and externally. So it's not really appropriate anymore for a small group of people to dictate to everybody else what the change program is. So when we talk about who, it's not just about who is being told what to do, it's about who is included in the whole program in terms of decision making, who has got to make changes not only to the external things like job role, meetings and process, but also about the way that people behave, about the way they interact with people. And you can't tell people to do that stuff. It has to come from within. And so therefore there needs to be a different type of engagement with people to allow that sort of inner self-development to happen so that people can interact differently. So it's not only the who, when we think about who, it's about what that interaction is with this who.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really getting to this shared sense of ownership, right? This everybody, as much as you can, right? It might not be possible to get to this fully and 100% coverage with everybody, but at least make a serious attempt to really bring in as many people as possible that are going to have to do something about the change, right? It goes back to this notion, if you ask anybody who wants to be changed, well, maybe not that many, right? But if you're part of defining what the change is all about and part of the thought process of where do we want to get to, the chances that you're identifying with the change and you're actually helping it and making it a better and more successful endeavor is much, much higher, right? Yeah. That's the whole spirit behind that.
Absolutely. And then the question, of course, comes is, how much change has to happen with people? And everybody has to change the same, or does people change differently? And really, whenever we approach a change program, we're really looking at what business objectives are we actually trying to achieve? What's the main reason behind the change? And often we come up with an optimizing goal for the organization. What is it we're actually trying to optimize around that we're not being able to achieve now? And when we look at that optimizing goal, we can start then to determine, well, who is responsible for that ultimately, and then who needs to work differently to enable that business goal. Mm-hmm. And typically, this normally starts off with a bunch of leaders or senior managers who are responsible for this type of change or this particular outcome that the business needs to achieve. So we've identified certainly there is a leadership team that needs to be part of this program. Often that team perhaps doesn't have the expertise, for example, to do a change program. And so there may then need to be other people who help them. And this is where the role of, say, agile coaches or enterprise coaches who are experienced in change programs may then also be included. And then we can start looking a bit wider. Can those people change everything themselves? If they change the way they're working, does that solve the problem? If it does solve the problem, awesome, that's it. You don't need to include anyone else. However, highly unlikely that that's it. Normally, it's delivery staff, it's all the, you may have IT involved, you may have all of the enabling functions, for example, HR, legal, marketing, maybe they need to also work on, say, an iterative basis. And then, of course, that's internal to the company. And we also have our customers. What's the point in iterating through and producing valuable items for customers if they're not engaged, they don't feed back, for example?
Right, right. And just one additional side or aspect of the leadership discussion. It's, by the way, very important. That's one of the things that I think we've both observed where it sometimes becomes difficult or even breaks down, is when leaders feel, particularly senior leaders feel like, oh, you go, you do this, right? I sponsor this. I'm helpful as much as I can, but you really take right the torch and run with this. That's really not going to cut it, most likely. You really have to have leadership being very active, immersing themselves in this change, because it will affect their way of working more likely than not quite profoundly. And so if they're not really an active part of driving this and also setting the example for the remainder of the population in the organization, it's not going to be likely successful, right? So it's very, very important. Tolerating or encouraging others to be part of this and changing is not going to be sufficient. It's really necessary that particular senior leaders take a very active role and showing, how they will actually evolve their way of working, how they're maybe interacting with others differently, among themselves differently. That is paramount to a success of an agile transformation.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head, Wolfgang. I think of the companies that we've worked for, plus obviously at AWA, we train hundreds, if not thousands of people every year in enterprise change. And one of the biggest, what a lot of people call impediments in a way, is that leadership have delegated the responsibility of change to others, or they've looked to change other people rather than looking at themselves. This is the biggest hindrance that we hear from all of these hundreds of different companies that come through our training courses. And often they say, well, how do I make leaders change? How do I encourage or sell this idea to leadership? And really, this is the wrong way around. And that's not really going to work. Often I have this conversation and it goes something like this. If you could speak to senior leadership and say, well, is what you do effective? Are you effective in the company? Is what you do on your day make a difference to this company? And very unlikely are they going to say no. The answer is yes, of course. I think I'm effective. What I'm doing in my day is important. And I do, as a leader of the company, I tend to shape this business because that's the role of being a leader, right? So how is it that if this leadership doesn't want to change the way that they show up, do they think that the organization is going to change? Because if they're effective and the way that they're showing up and the way that when we say showing up, I mean the way that they behave with people, the relationships they have, the type of demands that they put on people, these types of things shape the business. If they don't shape the business, what's the point of them being there? If it does shape the business, then if they don't change, how is anything else going to change in the organization? So it's basic logic that these people who are running and shaping the organization, the senior leadership team, we need to work with these people because they need to drive this and change the way that they show up to enable change throughout the organization. And that's kind of where we always focus first on helping people to understand what it is they need to do. So it's not a scary thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that ties back to what we had mentioned in the earlier discussions, right? Again, about the goal. Why are we even doing this, right? What are we doing? So it's not just a few procedures, let's say, on how we crank out the code or test it. It is really a very comprehensive, how do we even discover what to do? How do we iterate over it? And all the way until we deliver it to the customer. It is very comprehensive, this change, and that is often underestimated. So if you're trying to do it locally, just within one department, it may help, but it certainly misses a lot of the potential you have to really change to the better, right? And that's that's why we're casting such a wide net with our understanding of who needs to be involved leadership, the different departments, the different stakeholders, from the employees. Obviously, the customer is very important, right? If the customer is expecting still kind of like a behavior in the old ways, right? Then you may not get to the full potential of what this could be, right? What this could help to evolve also the customer supplier relationship and drive to a better outcome, as well as the stakeholders around you, right? How do you involve the community around you, your shareholders, right? If you're going with the old school, oh, this is all I care about is the bottom line here, the profit margin, but I neglect all the other aspects that are critical to make a business successful, like obviously the highest customer value, the employees that really want to work there and want to work there longer term. If you neglect those aspects, even as a shareholder, you might not find yourself in the situation you want to be, let's say 5 years, 10 years from now, right? So it is important to really be inclusive in that discussion of who is involved, right?
Yeah, and I've actually seen very well, so it's a good example of what you've talked about, but in a negative sense. We were working for a company a few years ago where the predominant focus was on keeping shareholders happy. And of course, the shareholders have provided some working capital in this case for tranches of money for the organization to get up to speed, to start making a profit. And then, of course, shareholders want that return. But because the entire company was focused on keeping shareholders happy in order to get the next tranche of money, the staff were extremely miserable, high turnover of staff, and very little was actually being faced on customers. And there was not much feedback from customers because the customers weren't really producing much money. There weren't many customers at that early stage of development for this new product. And so they were largely overlooked, and making sure that the investors had all the information, the investors were happy and everything else. And of course, by the third tranche of money, there wasn't enough customers, enough staff had left with enough expertise, they couldn't really get off the ground, which then meant that all the work and hard work that everybody had put in who were there, and they did work really hard trying to get this thing off the ground, but focused purely on investors, that of course the third tranche of money didn't come and everybody lost their jobs. I really do believe that that particular failure was because the investors were very demanding. The behavior and the way that they showed up demanded that everybody bent to their will, and the senior people of the company who had taken on this investment were literally terrified of upsetting their investors, and that fear created stress, and that stress echoed throughout the entire organization. And people who had come to work who did really quite unrelated to the investment model, but coming to do development work, coming to do a job where they want relationships, they want to grow themselves, all of that was completely neglected. And those people who were learning about the product, who had that information and knowledge, then would leave after sort of 6 months in a sort of disillusioned state, and of course that meant failure. So that's a negative example of what you're talking about, where the focus has gone on just one group of people in an old school way of working, rather than that kind of who do we include in this transformation, who do we include in this way of working, and really making sure that we include everybody. Yes. in that approach.
Yes, yeah, I think this is a key aspect, right, to be worth highlighting. It is about really balancing the various key interests, right, the key stakeholders' interests in such a transformation to get it better. Whether you get it right in the next iteration, maybe not, but get it substantially better so that you build a system that can kind of keep incorporating feedback and keep getting better and better and better and ultimately get it right, right? And this is not just, obviously the discussion between shareholder and, let's say, employees' interests, find the right balance there is what you just touched on. Another example, what I've seen where things, left room for improvement was when, on the one hand, you had a very strong push, you want to be very customer focused, very, knowledgeable about what really creates the customer. So we had great opportunities to collaborate very tightly and very iteratively and very frequently with customers to really understand what made a difference for them in building and envisioning first, but then building and delivering introducing a new product stream. At the same time, you had kind of like the safeguards within the company that, for whatever reasons, had put certain compliance rules out, right? And when the discussion came, so where do we go now, right? When you have to have an argument to dissolve some disagreement, one side took the view of, it's really the customers, they're knocking our doors, they clearly see they've gotten what they need, so we need to authorize them to actually now fully use it and support it well. And on the other hand, you have the interest, no, I don't care what the customer says, I'm just here to serve the process, right? Makes you wonder, how you actually dissolve that. So that's why it is very important to have, at the start of such a change, of such a transformation, really considered well the various key stakeholders, and maybe they're already get to an agreement, when push comes to shove, this is the primary principle by which we will resolve and drive this forward. And this is maybe a secondary, right? If you have these clarified at the very early point, and actually together and transparently for everybody, right? We're all seeing the same thing, makes it so much easier on the further evolution, as opposed to your considering everything is priority one, or everybody has the right of way, and then it clashes when you're really in the midst of trying to get something delivered, right?
I think that's the key thing, is this transparency and then having that feedback as well. So we've got we've talked about senior leadership, we've talked about customers, we've talked about suppliers, and of course the staff and investors. So we've got all these different people, and somehow we're optimizing for a new goal. The organization is not achieving something. That's why we're making the change in the first place. So we're optimizing around this goal, and we're going to be trying different things to change the way that we work, the way that we relate to each other, and the frequency of which we relate to each other as well. And so to get that cadence right of communication, of connecting together to work out this new way of working, there is going to be a bit of trial and error in that. And so having that feedback and openness to be able to say, hey, look, let's have a meeting once a week, and then you find that's a bit too much. Well, let's have a meeting every fortnight. Or it could be the way that I'm giving my the workout is based around the solutions that I've come up with. So other people are now following tasks. Or should I be sharing the problem space and then collaborating with others to come up with solutions? Which way works best? And for different problems, that's going to be different. So we need to explore in the organization, what do these relationships look like? What is the way that I'm delegating not only work, but also power and decision making? And these types of changes are absolutely required in a transformation to rethink the way that we behave and look at work and how we relate to each other in order to re-optimize to meet these business goals. And that does take a bit of trial and error. So there has to be a psychological safety for people to be able to explore different ways of working and maybe not hit the optimum straight away. And so that's another thing that has to be there right from the beginning, this cultivation of this psychological safety in order for people to be able to try and find the right balance to achieve that business objective.
Very important. I think this psychological safety is kind of like the foundation, right, on which you have to stand to really start establishing and build trust, right? So that even if I know you have a different viewpoint, you have a different interest in your role within the organization, I still trust that at the end of the day, we're in this together, right? And we will find a workable compromise between different positions if we have that trust in each other, right? If we do not have that trust in each other, if we have to fear for safety, psychological safety, right? It's very hard to reach agreements, to reach compromises that will really survive over, a reasonable time. and can be evolving into, making the system better and better and better. So that's paramount. And that's why, again, it's very important to bring the key people into this and have transparency about their different interests, what triggers them, what makes them be successful, and how do we bring it all together so that we're all successful, right?
Yeah, and I think that the biggest barrier to that is something which I've been calling privilege. So often we've heard about sort of race privilege or gender privilege, but we don't often talk about status privilege. And when we think about our organizations, mostly they're organized into hierarchical structures. So there are the people at the top, which are typically leaders, and then senior managers, and then it goes down to junior or mid-level or junior managers, depending on how big the organization is. And we have this kind of pyramid structure. And one of the biggest challenges is that those people at the top, and mostly we work with the people at the top, are quite blind to the authority and the power that they have. And amongst that group, often there is quite a lot of psychological safety within that group. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's like a war zone there at the top. But often people feel quite comfortable in their position, especially when they're looking down the hierarchy, maybe sometimes with their peers, sometimes not. And that gives the impression that because they feel safe with all the people below them, that the people below them also feel safe with them. And that is a asymmetrical relationship because of the hierarchy that's in organizations. And often that privilege of being at the top, we are blind to our own privilege. And so we behave in ways which we expect people to see that we're treating them equally. But because there is a hierarchy, that is actually not the case. And so often people below us, below the senior leaders, won't feel safe, but we won't know. And so we act in a certain way, and this is where opportunity is lost. So the people who speak up, the people who don't speak up is a silent indicator. So when someone doesn't speak up, it's not an indicator we can see. It's a hidden feature. So the lack of psychological safety is hidden from us. You can't see it. And so we have to build in feedback mechanisms and trust, which takes time, especially if your organization is starting from a fairly toxic or huge mistrust. And again, at the top, they may not even know them. So having the necessary feedback or interventions where we can actually create a sort of systemic, we do this with systemic coaching or bringing out in a safe space what people really feel, can be quite revealing and difficult for those leaders who have had privilege blindness before. But really, we have to get through that to enable a change towards psychological safety, which will enable that inclusion and ownership of the entire business to get to the point where we're working together to solve these business problems. So that feedback cycle has to be there, and it has to be honest. And sometimes we need outside facilitators to achieve.
Right. Yeah, so that's a very good point. So it's not even just enough to say you're casting your net very wide to have the different constituencies, right, or different stakeholders covered in shaping and driving your transformation. There might very well have to be way more preparatory work to even get to the gist of, who is kind of like a thought leader or actually in terms of insights, kind of like a gold mine of what needs to be changed, right? Which so far, as you indicated, could be just kept silent because, they don't feel like their insights are appreciated or are welcome or even invited to the table, right? So yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think early indicators of this. So we'll talk about the how we do this. So we typically come in and we do assessments and things, and we help, and they're very interactive and they're engaging. But we'll talk about that in the fourth video. But just as a hint around this, an early indicator might be that if you are a senior leader or senior manager, and you have this feeling that the staff below you aren't stepping up to the job, they're not taking the initiative, they're not being entrepreneurial, they're not making the decisions. Why can't these people do X, Y, Z? Then most likely you've got privilege blindness and you're not in a psychological safe state, because most people come to work wanting to make a difference, wanting to do well in their job. And if they're not doing that, then there's something stopping them, and that's most likely you. So that's something that's hard to take on.
There's a good, this is has nothing to do with agile insights or whatnot. It's, I think, just common sense, right? I learned early in my career, when you're pointing to someone else, right? Think back where these other three fingers are pointing.
Brilliant. I haven't heard
Right.
that before. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very good, very good. Yeah. So we've thought about the different things. So is there? We've talked about the leadership. Normally, it's leadership who start off with trying to solve the underlying business problem, and then normally we go wider into the staff. It's like, well, who else do I need to go on this journey? We also need to make sure that any changes that we do affect the pipeline, the supply pipeline. So we've talked about a bit about customers. Is there anything else about customers or suppliers that perhaps we wanted to talk about?
It's the customer, I think, is a very important one, right? That you depends on obviously what your business model in general is, right? Whether you're, let's say, more in a consumer facing, whether you are more in a business to business facing interaction, you obviously have to apply different techniques to really get to insights about what the customers are really needing, right? So, but that's very key to have, even if you don't have directly a customer's seat at the table, right? That you find appropriate proxies or appropriate ways to really get to this, what is called customer empathy, right? Customer insight of what is it really the problem that the customer is trying to solve, so that you can really think through and provide better solutions to this, right? Remember back to Henry Ford's statement, if I would have asked people what they wanted, faster horses, maybe not, right? So, you really need to get behind what is it that the customer is actually trying to solve, trying to do, and then find the right solutions for it, right? And that's, again, much easier said than done. Let's say, just an initiative to go for, we're now becoming customer centric, and I run statistics now on how often I have calls with the customers. May help,
Yeah,
but you may be talking to the wrong people within the customer's organization and not actually get to that insight. So it's much more the how, and it's much more the quality of the insights you're gathering, right, than just the quantity of interaction points, right?
yeah, and I think it's so important that to get that right cadence and the right quality and the right people, etc., to get that feedback. Otherwise, we're shooting in the dark. And as we know, that the whole problem space that we're working in is one that's adaptive and changes all the time. So even if we get some information from customers in 6 months' time, or sometimes even less, in a few minutes' time, that information may be old. Competitors may have responded to the work we're doing and change the marketplace around us. So the things that we thought were innovative are now secondhand because other people have beat us to it. So, the world changes constantly, and getting that feedback is key. With suppliers, it's also often I hear that companies are saying, well, look, we're in the middle of a supply chain, or maybe we're at the end of a supply chain. And it's all very well us working in an iterative, agile way, but our suppliers don't work like that. So how do we then work with them? And there's some experience that I've had with them. We're working with a company, again, a few years ago, where they had many suppliers. Meaning their job was really putting bits together from many suppliers. And we noticed that we had something like about 100 suppliers. And the vast majority of them worked in a very traditional waterfall way for the software parts. And other parts were nothing to do with software, big companies which didn't really have much customer service even. And so the company that I'm thinking about was actually a public sector council. And they had all these different suppliers. And one of these suppliers was a waste management company. I think I may have told you about this before, Wolfgang, but for the benefit of people here in this video, this waste company was, they had bin lorries and the whole taking all the rubbish from people's houses and all this kind of thing. Massive infrastructure. And the biggest concern for the citizens at the time was that they wanted to be able to interact and when bins are full, when there's bins out in the countryside, which big lorries would go out to empty the bins and find they're already empty. So millions and millions of pounds worth of petrol costs were being consumed by all these lorries across the town. And one of the key things was to try to save money, to reduce the cost of running the council, but at the same time not reduce services to citizens. And so this was a key area of reduction. But the outsourced supplier said, no, look, we're not going to change. We're not going to interact with customers. We're just going to do our job, and maybe in 2 years' time we'll review it. So this being the priority for us as an agile transformation group to digitalize and to upgrade and reduce cost for the council, this was an area where we got stuck. So we've got a supplier. We want to become more agile. The supplier says, no, not interested. It's not like there's 10 bin companies you can go to swap your thing. This is one infrastructure company. So as a company, we had to move on to a different supplier and tackle a lower priority problem. So we did that because we didn't have a choice. And then as we worked around all the other things, I went away and I was coming back less periodically because the council was becoming more and more agile and needed us as external coaches less. And one day I came back about 6 months later and everybody's working on the new waste problem. And I said, oh, did the supplier change their mind then? And they said, no, they didn't. They refused to. I said, how are we doing this agile? Work with them then. They said, we're not. We went out to venture capital. We went and raised money. We created our own bin company. We've hired all the trucks. We've done all the stuff. And now we're saving millions. And they saved millions and millions by putting little, the Internet of Things. We nicknamed it the Internet of Bins. And we had this Internet of Bins wired up around the city so that trucks wouldn't go to places unless they were full. And saved millions of pounds on this thing. Had the same service. And it was back on. And so if we can crack that one, then I think that anybody can look at their suppliers and rethink their business model to succeed and win.
Yeah, well, and I think in particular when it comes to supply chains, particularly if they are more comprehensive, more evolved, established structures, it is very important to go back to what you keep always emphasizing on this system thinking. Right? The system thinking is key to understand. You have to optimize the whole. So what good does it do? And I think, for example, the automotive industry is right now figuring this or discovering this and has to get their arms around this. Right, where there is a very sophisticated, a very comprehensive way of slicing the different parts, the different components, the different elements of a car into different suppliers, right? And that has led that I think there was a research done a couple of years ago. I think was it on average something 20 plus different operating systems that an average European or North American built car has inside of itself. So now imagine if you want to run an upgrade and you want to check compatibility between those different 20 plus systems. It's quite a complex task, right? So no wonder that, changing any of this, like over the air, doing an update over the air is kind of a challenge, right? Now, if new entrants like a leading mobile supplier from the Silicon Valley, starting with a T, comes in, and I was told, or I read somewhere, I think they have like 3 different operating systems inside of the car. Changing over the air obviously needs a few other details to run well, right? In the whole tool chain, the whole, there are different, more aspects to it. But nevertheless, your starting position to even manage this in terms of complexity is way better, right?
Yeah.
Is systematically better than if you're coming from a very, well, I have to assume for all good reasons, a fairly sophisticated supply chain that has accumulated different systems and are not easy to change because this is between company lines, right? This is between intellectual property right protections, etc., right? I have to assume. So, that's another aspect when you think about supply chain. How do you involve suppliers in this? At the end of the day, it's not about optimizing for the suppliers. It's ultimately the customer. Do I get the value when I drive this thing? Is it up to date? Is it getting the best value, the best capability, the best functionality that I can possibly acquire on the market right now? Right? The verdict is out.
I think with Lean and Agile, the customer is the central focus for optimization, and really drives the patterns through all of the other all the other people that we've been talking about, for sure. One last thing that I was thinking of is another thing to consider when we talk about who is wider society. So we've seen quite a few things in the news recently about companies which have or have had things uncovered which perhaps they wish they hadn't, which have significantly detrimented their relationships with customers. For example, the incident with the car, which we mentioned automotive, with the exhaust fumes actually being coded in diagnostic mode, that you put it into diagnostic mode to test the fumes, and it automatically produces cleaner fumes than it would do on the road. And of course, you've got that balance between exhaust pollution and performance of the car. So they've advertised these incredibly performant cars at low emissions, but actually it's a fake. And so that was uncovered.
Right.
And we hear about all these things about sort of child labour in Asia producing clothing. We've had a big scandal here in the last couple of years for high street shops. The clothing that we love to wear, you suddenly find it's been produced by a child working 12 hours for nothing in Asia, and suddenly this piece of clothing doesn't feel so good anymore. So there's a lot of other things like that.
Right. Yeah. And so it's, as I think you mentioned in the beginning, it's not just the employees, the shareholders, the customers, the management, the leadership, etc., as well as the community. And the community could be just in the neighborhood, but it also very much could be the community at large, right? The world community. How responsibly are we acting now? It might be a little bit more difficult to find the right proxy to take a seat at the table of defining the transformation, but hey, there are intelligent ways to at least figure out how you can consider these appropriately and bring the right representation.
I think having a good ethics model is pretty good. One of the things that we do is we develop an ethics model so that people can work to what ethics they believe and make decisions around an ethics framework to enable these kind of decisions. I mean, I often think about banking, and so I've worked in banking for most of my career, and the banks actually do a lot of good, but we don't think about that when we think of banks. We think banks are generally these money-grabbing, self-serving, terrible organizations, and all bankers are evil. And that seems to be the way that the press and most people think of bankers. And when we actually look back over why this is, if you look at some of the banking scandals, for example, obviously the big one was the 2008 crash to do with mortgage and sublet prime mortgages and all those kind of things. And that's actually a very, very small section of the banking world that deals with that. And then you look at some of the LIBOR terrible behaviors that happen with setting and faking the LIBOR things. Again, very, very small set of people involved in the banks. Of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people working in the banks, most of them are doing good work, serving customers and providing a good service for people to be able to manage their own financial affairs. But we don't think of it like that at all, because a few people who make very bad, unethical decisions have really made the whole industry bad taste. And so, thinking about who, we need to think of a wider reputation perspective and really work on an ethical framework throughout the entire organization, not just a few.
Right. Yeah, and consider the different sides of the coin, so to speak. Right. So again, if you're only optimizing for an ROI or for a stock price evaluation, right, that might actually lead you to a little bit of short-sighted view with all the other things we just discussed. Right.
Okay. So I think what you said originally, which was about balance, about including everybody, and of course, including everybody might mean thousands or tens of thousands of people in your organization. And so next session, we'll talk about the how. How do we actually go about doing this? How do you include people in? What is the process around making sure that everybody's involved and not being overwhelmed by this huge task? But we'll talk about that in our fourth session, which will be coming up shortly.
Yep.
Is there anything else we wanted to chat about before we close this video?
I think we're pretty much there.
Good, fantastic. All right, well, thank you for listening or watching, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Thank you.
See you. Thanks.